If a charger is difficult to use for one person, it's frustrating. If it's impossible for another, it's a failure of design and a legal liability. Accessibility is a non-negotiable in EV charging. Welcome back to another episode of EV Charging Minute, your place to get ideas, tips, and all kinds of good knowledge to help you maximize your ROI on commercial EV charging. I'm Tony Booth, your host and founder of Stay in Charge, where we can, you can find a bunch of information, and we help we primarily help commercial real estate property owners and managers all, solve this EV charging challenge and help you boost your property revenues and values with EV charging. Today, we're going to take a look at accessibility for EV charging. Okay. Something that, obviously when you build a commercial building, you have codes, you have regulations, and there is accessibility requirements throughout your building, from the parking lot and everything else, to how to get in and ramps. And, we know a lot about that stuff because it's been there for a long time. And, we have codes to respond to. So just like everything inside your building and outside your building, when it comes to accessibility, where there's rules, stuff with elevators and all that kind of stuff, everything has rules, right? It's no different for EV charging, except for the fact that, a lot of the rules have not been fully adopted, right? Or adapted into local jurisdictions. And so it's a little bit, since it's a new kind of thing, it's not always obvious what to do. And there are some areas that they're a little bit still gray. So we're going to take a look at it. Make sure we get a good understanding of what's required, and just at least, not necessarily what's required, but at least what we think about, what we want to pay attention to. And we're going to look at the space, kind of where these things are positioned in parking spaces, because, that's a big part of accessibility. We're going to look at the equipment, and then we're going to talk a little bit about planning and protection. Now, one thing I want to point out here in the beginning, we are not the full experts when it comes to accessibility requirements. That is the local code. The local regulators are the ones that really implement the rules. So we understand what the standards are. We understand what the recommendations are, because there's written documentation out there that we can read and we can see. But that does not mean that your jurisdiction has adopted those codes or uses them, by the current recommendations. They may have stricter ones, they may have more, or they may not have any at all. And to be honest, what we find a lot of times, in the EV charging space yet today, is many of the jurisdictions do not have any formal kind of process of reviewing the EV charging additions. So we got to be careful, because there could become a time where they do. There could be a time where that things change. And so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to this. What I will say is, what we're seeing more and more anyway, I can't say this for 100%, but we are seeing more and more, even in locations and states that don't have a very big EV penetration yet, we are starting to see the requirement of an EV charger, or at least an EV charger ready space in the initial design during new construction. So you're going to find that when you're building something new, a lot of times there are going to be code requirements that you provide EV charging. And when they do put that, you will typically find there will be a requirement for at least one accessible design. What typically happens in all this stuff is just like anything else. If you have a very small building and your code requires 5 parking spots, you're probably only required to put 1 handicap spot. If you're required to put 50, you might have to put 5 or 6 or 8. Just depends on those, kind of variables, those percentages that your code requires. And the same is going to happen with EV charging. So what will end up happening is you'll see that, they might have a rule that says 1 out of 10, 1 out of 8, 1 out of 5. Like, it'll depend on how they adopt that. but typically you're going to have some type of requirement like that that says if you put in EV chargers, you're going to most likely have at least one that is fully accessible in a space. If it's new construction, again, in existing construction, a lot of jurisdictions are still kind of leaving that up to the owner, leaving that up to the property. What we typically do when we're working with a property is if it's easy, we will definitely put one in an accessible space. Like obviously, if it's brand new, we want to put them in accessible spaces at all times. But looking at new properties, right? Like we will typically tell that host property that, like to check your local jurisdiction, see what kind of things they require. We'll work with them to, try to figure out what's the best solution there because, again, these are one of those things. If it's going to require rebuilding a parking lot, then it's probably, it may not be something you want to do yet. Okay. So we try to make sure that we're doing the best we can to accommodate what's there. But obviously, we're always going to make sure that all of our properties are at least compliant with any codes and regulations at the time of installation. Okay, so with that being said, when you look at a space, what the general requirements are for a space right now that you're going to have at least one EV charging space, and that's typically going to be a van accessible space. So if you're familiar with EV, with accessibility regulations, an accessible stall, a handicapped stall, is wider than the normal stall. A normal stall is typically 9 feet wide. An accessible stall is going to be 11 or 12 feet wide. Okay. With EV charging, they also require that you put an accessible aisle or a wheelchair aisle along with that, which is typically 5 feet, right? And that's where you see the hash painted aisleway next to a parking stall. So if you're putting in a charger today and you want to make an accessible space, what's typically going to happen is you're going to use up 2 spaces to build that space, right? So you're going to have, you're going to have your standard, a typical thing is 18 wide, right? I mean, a typical space is 9 feet wide, so 2 spaces are 18. To comply with an accessible space, you need at least 17. So since you're kind of fitting in or putting into existing, that's typically the way that we would have the striping be done is we would take up a second space. And that would allow us to put that extra room there in that aisle. And that aisle would typically come up to where your charger is located. That way, the wheelchair, they get out of their van, they can roll right up that accessible aisle and they can get to the charger. So that's really the kind of the main thing that comes to the requirements in a space. A couple little things to really make sure you kind of catch here as well. If you're putting any bollards up or protective bumpers for your chargers, make sure those aren't going to impede access with the wheelchair as well. You will have to have wheelchair access to the front of the charger or the interactive piece of the charger if there's an interactive piece. Okay, so think about, on a level 2 side, a lot of times the interaction is just grabbing the cord because you're going to start the charger and manage the charger through a mobile app. So you don't have to be as concerned there, like which way that charger's facing and which way, the wheelchair would access to that. But when you start getting into DC chargers where you may have a POS credit card machine and things like that, obviously you can't have that machine face into the parking lot and then have bollards that don't allow access to get to the machine. So you want to pay attention to those things to make sure you're getting there and getting that proper being able to get proper access. Like if it's up on a sidewalk, maybe it's up above the curb and it's on a sidewalk, that's okay as long as there's an accessible route for them to get around and get to that charger. Obviously, this is talking retrofit. Obviously, if it's new construction, you want to make every possibility, like everything as easy as possible and make sure that charger is facing into that aisleway, right? Like if I'm designing this brand new, I'm going to have an aisleway, and I'm going to make sure that charger is facing into that aisleway. But if it's a retrofit, what we normally will pay attention to is where are the cords hanging, where are things like that. Can a wheelchair person get access to that in the requirements that are out there? Okay, so those are the kind of the main things, but we want to keep an eye out. They are looking at new rules and regulations, right? There was some stuff that almost came out last year. They were going to, put some new rules in, and luckily the board decided to hold off and get some more input, see what happens more on kind of the industry standards and what's happening. Because what was interesting in some of the stuff I saw in the early version, they were actually kind of looking at revamping what a handicap van accessible parking stall would look like. And I think somebody had thought that they needed to add more space to kind of have that charger up in the front of the space. But when you think about, like, when I was talking to somebody about it, I was like, this is going to really impact putting in charging, because it's one thing to repaint a stall, use existing spaces and things like that. But if I have to start ripping out curb and sidewalk and doing major renovations to a parking stall, it's going to really drive the cost up. So I want to make sure you're paying attention to those things, that somebody is of what's coming out down the future as well, so that we're maintaining compliance and implying and building anything new in compliance. So wrapping up the space side, a little bit of take action. What's important to take away from here, your key takeaway or action steps. Make sure that when you're installing EV chargers, that you've consulted and found out what your local jurisdictions do require. Okay, that's number one. Make sure you understand that, because the last thing you want to do is put these things in, have somebody show up, one of your code officials show up and say, hey, you didn't put an accessible space in. We got, you got to take those things out, right? Like, so now you've got to kind of redo everything or modify the space. So make sure we're checking that. Pay attention to having an accessible space, an accessible route from the charging system and your parking spot to the front entrance, right? Again, accessibility, you got to have that route. Most of your parking lots are going to have routes that a wheelchair can take, right? So that you have the proper ramps and all that stuff, because you don't want a person in a wheelchair to get out, coming in their van, they do everything, they get out, they connect, they hook up their charger, and now they don't have a way to get that, to get to the entrance of the property. So make sure you take a look at all that, and then make sure you have proper signage that this is a wheelchair space. I will say that one thing that some jurisdictions do, and I mean, it's really not like, I hope they don't allow this on new builds, but I understand it can be feasible on when you're kind of retrofitting some EV charging. But what they did was they were allowing you to have what they call a used last or a dual use handicap EV charging space. So that van accessible space that we made for, if we installed 4 chargers and we made one van accessible, what they were allowing people to do is, if you had proper signage, you could put signage up that said that it was a EV charging / handicap parking stall, and it was used last. So in other words, if a normal EV driver came in and the 3 spaces, right, like a non wheelchair bound, or somebody that didn't have accessible permitting, right, did not need, there was 3 chargers being used already, and the only charger was the one that was designed for accessibility. If the others were being used, they could use that charger even though they weren't handicap permitted, as long as they were charging. And then when they were done charging, they'd have to move. The caveat to this is you must meet full requirements of handicap parking outside of that, combined space. If you were to put a charger in one of your handicap stalls, your existing required handicap stalls, then it cannot be a joint use stall. You can't take a code requirement of 6 handicap spaces and make one an EV joint use. But it was a way for people to, at least if you put 2 chargers in, you weren't putting one in that could only be used by an accessibly permitted driver. So that's something to pay attention to as well. That can help out on retrofitting if you want to make sure you're compliant, but you're also not, kind of putting in an extra charger for no reason. So those are the things to make sure you have. Make sure you have proper signage. When you make that oversized stall, make sure you've got your aisleway painted in. Make sure the stall markings indicate that it's a handicap / EV charging space and all that stuff. Okay, and then proper directions. A lot of times these aren't, handicap is typically put up near the front of the building. Often EV chargers are not. So there might be a longer route for them to get to, to accessibly get back to the front of the building. So make sure that route is indicated, in some proper signage. Because we may have these, they may have to go, down to the end of the parking lot to where there's, an island with a ramp. And that's cool. That's fine. It's not a requirement that, that these things have to be at the front door. Okay. But it has to be a requirement that you're accessible. And I promise you, if the majority of people that are, accessible permitted drivers that drive EVs and want charging, they're not going to be, like, oh, well, why is my space not at the front? Just like any EV driver, if they know they can get charging, that's more important than the absolute location. As long as it is accessible and I can get there, I would be upset, and they would be rightfully upset if you put a charger in the back of your parking lot, and when they got out, they ended up being stuck to where there's no curb ramps, there's no sidewalks for them to get to the building. Okay, so we can't do that, but we have to make sure we're doing it properly. Moving on to the equipment. So the equipment gets a little bit, can be a little tricky, but it's not anything out, extremely onerous at this point in time. The main thing is the reach, right? So standard for handicap is like 15 inches above and not higher than 48 inches. Well, that's where the most of the stuff's going to come into when you start looking at handicap accessibility for the equipment side of things. So think about where that charger might be mounted on the pedestal and things like that, where the hooks are, where the cords are going to be held for the driver when they come out to get them. So this is where we've got to look at all that. This often comes down to your manufacturer and your supplier, but make sure that they're doing that the parts are within reach for anybody that has accessibility requirements. Most of the L2 side, like, one of the things to look at here, most of the L2 side, you're using some type of mobile app to interact with that charger. So even if it has a screen and things like that, if those are a little higher, it doesn't matter because that's not a requirement for operating the charger, which is actually very good because you think about it, people that have accessibility needs have already adapted with their phone. So when they're using my app, they have accessible phone features that allow them to use my app without, with much easier interface. So the important thing there is make sure that your charging company, whoever's created your platform and any mobile app or interface and things like that, that they're accessible, right? That's a very important thing. If you have if you have one of these things where they've got to go on a website landing page to put in their credit cards and things like that, is that accessible? Because that could cause a problem if you don't, provide me a proper way to get there and find that stuff, then this becomes a problem. On the equipment side, if you're doing DC fast charging, then you're typically going to have some type of credit card POS system. So we want to make sure that thing is accessible, right? Like, I've seen different designs of chargers where, that machine, that credit card machine might be placed on the side somewhere and everything else is in the front. And, think about that. You've got curbing, you've got a place to wheel up to the front of the charger, but then they've placed the credit card machine on the side. Well, now I don't have a ramp. I don't have a flat space. You know, can I even accessible? Can I even get to the credit card machine, or do I have to end up rolling around and going all the way around to get to the side of the machine, up on the sidewalk, and then possibly all the way back around? So make sure you're paying attention to that, and that your service providers or equipment providers are as well. Some other things that fall into this, and hopefully people are paying attention to it on the manufacturing side. There are some general guidelines. Okay, there's not necessarily requirements. Again, this could vary by jurisdiction, so don't take my word as as a absolute here. But there's guidance on the amount of strength that it takes. Right, everything with accessibility does get into strength, because obviously I've got to have, I can't have too hard of a thing to activate. Like, you can't have opening a door to be so onerous that I can't do it in my wheelchair, which is why a lot of doors have the, accessibility button that you push that will open the door for them. So when it comes to that, like, one of the guidelines they have now is you shouldn't have to exert more than 5 pounds of strength, 5 to 7 pounds of strength for lifting the cords, unplugging the cords, plugging the cords in. Those type of things are all part of kind of the guidelines. Audible assistance is a thing. Even Braille on the machine. Like, you may need to have Braille on your machine that would give someone that is blind the ability to read the machine and understand what their instructions are. And yeah, I mean, people that are blind, do have ability to drive. There are things of that happening. So don't think it's like not. It is part of the new standards that they're working on. That was part of the new standards. So these things are all things that need to be paid attention to. Cord management is another big thing when you start looking at accessibility. So a lot of times what we recommend in a stall might be to have the retractors in that instance, because at least that way it's kind of pulling those cords back up off of the pavement area, so you don't have hazards where somebody in a wheelchair can't roam the, if the cords are laying across the ground, they can't get through them. And obviously if the cords are laying across the ground, it's no longer up at that 15-inch level for them to even be able to pick the cord up. So a lot of times cord management is very important here on a handicapped space. Retracting cables is a great way to help handle that. It's not the be all end all, because even that, kind of, hits in the middle of the cable. So it's not like sucking it completely back into the machine, but it does help at least bring it back. So those are things to look at. What I would say for action items when it comes to ADA compliance with your equipment is that's something that ask your installer, your provider. What are they doing about accessibility? Are they meeting it with all their equipment? Are they familiar with the rules? And as long as they are, then that kind of becomes their responsibility. But make sure, right? Because they could tell you like, well, hey, we never told you it was ADA compliant. We just told you this is the charger. So then you can find yourself stuck. So make sure you kind of got that covered when you're talking to those. So the last thing I want to touch on here is planning and kind of that future protection of things. So when it comes to planning, you're planning out a new system or planning additions to your system. Even if you have existing systems, it doesn't hurt to kind of check into this, make sure that something didn't change, but talk with some experts. Okay. Typically this is going to be your engineering firms that would do parking lot designs and things like that. They're going to know what some of these requirements are, what these code requirements are. Check with your local jurisdictions. Many of the people it doesn't seem like it sometimes, but many of the people that are in those agencies that do inspections and doing code reviews and things like that, they're typically going to be pretty eager to help out, to give you, guidance on those things. One thing I would say is when you do ask for that guidance, when you're talking to them, obviously ask them to share what codes they have. Because sometimes they may know what, and they may be telling you like, hey, they may tell you more than the current codes because they may know that things are coming So make sure you have that conversation and ask them what's absolutely required, what's future requirements, what they might even recommend that you do. I know one of the properties that we did, we told them to go check with their code official, and they reached out to the local code people and said, here's what we're trying to do. What are your requirements? And actually that code person spent a little time, was really nice, told them what to do, actually told them, based on what they were doing and the fact they were only installing 2 chargers at this time, that they recommended that they didn't even do anything in relation to accessibility. And that what they recommended was have a written plan, at the property, that if someone were to come in and say, hey, I am a customer, I am in an accessible vehicle, but I need to charge, that somebody would, kind of help them with that. Because the reason why they told them not to is because they knew that there was going to be a lot of renovation to do that. It was not written into code yet. And so what this person was told was to hold off, but before you put any more in the future, make sure you deal with all this, or you do any parking lot improvements. So it's worth it talking to those people so that you make sure you're doing what's required. If you're building a new facility or doing any renovations to your facility, especially in a parking lot area, I would make sure I get all this and make sure your engineering is paying attention to all this. And then I'd make a note that annually or biannually, to make sure that I'm kind of checking with somebody, whether it's your provider that's put your chargers in, again, an engineer or local jurisdictions. Hey, are there any new things I need to be aware of? Are there things out there? Because as we know, this can end up causing a problem. So make sure you're staying up on this stuff and staying compliant. All right. At the end, EV charging is a great amenity for your guests, residents, and customers, right? They're all going to enjoy it. It's great for your property. It adds some great things for you, but we don't want it to add a pain point by missing some of the accessibility requirements. So make sure you check into this, that the people that you're working with are taking care of you and making sure you're compliant. All right. That's all for today's podcast. Next week, we're going to take a look at cybersecurity for your stations and your platform. Okay. This is a pretty big deal too. You hope that your people that you're working with are taking care of this, but we're going to talk about some things to think about, some things to worry about, and some questions to ask so that you can make sure that you're at least protected the best you can be from a cybersecurity standpoint. So that's all for today, everybody. Thank you, as always, for joining in and being a part of our podcast here. If you ever have any questions, comments, suggestions, anything like that, leave a comment or reach out anytime. info@stayincharge.com will always get to me or to somebody on the team so that we can, address your concerns or maybe add topics, or if somebody wants to be a guest, we're more than glad to talk about that as well. That's all. Hope you learned something new. Enjoy your day and have an amazing weekend. See you next week.